The storm came with no warning, like Judgment Day descending on the Nebraska territory. Rain pounded against the wooden walls of the Whitman homestead, as if God himself was trying to wash away the sins of the earth. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the sparse bedroom in harsh flashes of white. Adelaide Sinclair bent over the tiny writhing body of 6-month-old Grace Whitman, her fingers moving with practiced precision despite the tremor of exhaustion in her limbs. The child's skin burned with fever, her cries growing weaker by the hour. "Hold on, little one," Adelaide whispered, cutting strips from her own petticoat with quick, efficient movements. She soaked the cloth in cool water, wringing each piece with controlled force, before laying it gently across the baby's forehead. Nathaniel Whitman stood frozen in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted by the lamplight behind him. His face, usually stoic beneath his dark beard, was naked with fear. In his calloused hands he clutched a small wooden horse forgotten in the terror of the moment. "Should I ride for the doctor?" His voice cracked barely audible above the thunder. Adelaide didn't look up. "No time." She reached into a worn leather bag beside her, extracting a small bottle. With steady hands, she measured 3 drops into a spoonful of water. "Hold her head, please." Nathaniel moved forward, his large hands suddenly gentle as they cradled his daughter's head. Adelaide carefully tipped the mixture between Grace's parched lips. "Willow bark," she explained, her voice taking on the calm, authoritative tone she hadn't used since the war. "For the fever." The child sputtered, then swallowed. Adelaide nodded in approval. For 3 hours they fought the battle together, Adelaide commanding, Nathaniel following without question. She placed cold compresses on Grace's chest, checked her pulse with practiced fingers, and mixed tinctures from supplies Nathaniel hadn't even known existed in his own home. When Grace's breathing finally eased, her tiny chest rising and falling in a steadier rhythm, Adelaide's professional demeanor crumbled. She collapsed into the chair beside the crib, her hands shaking uncontrollably now that they no longer needed to be steady. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the room. In that brief, harsh light, Nathaniel saw what Adelaide usually kept hidden beneath her long sleeves. A jagged scar running from her wrist, nearly to her elbow, puckered and white against her skin. Their eyes met in the darkness that followed. Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding born of shared struggle. "My secret for yours, Mr. Whitman," Adelaide whispered, her eyes never leaving his. "I know you sought me out before that auction." 3 weeks earlier, Adelaide had stood on the auction block outside Frank Turner's feed store, chin held high despite the humiliation burning through her veins. The spring sun beat down mercilessly, making the dust stick to her skin and the single good dress she'd been allowed to keep. The crowd of Wildrose Creek's citizens gathered below, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright cruelty. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Men assessed her like livestock. "She can't bear children," Frank Turner called out, his voice carrying across the town square. "But she can cook, clean, sew, and she's educated too. Reads and writes better than most men." He paused for the expected laughter. "Starting bid at $10. Adelaide's gaze remained fixed on the distant horizon, refusing to acknowledge the jeers or the humiliation. Inside, her heart hammered against her ribs like a wild thing caged. This was what she had been reduced to, property to be sold to the highest bidder. Victor Caldwell. Her brother-in-law stood to the side of the platform, his thin lips curved in satisfaction. After her husband William's death in the mine collapse, Victor had systematically stripped away everything Adelaide owned. The family home, William's medical instruments, even her wedding ring, all claimed as payment for debts. When there was nothing left to take, He had convinced his sister that Adelaide was cursed, a barren woman who brought death to the men in her life. $8, someone called. The voice was followed by coarse laughter. 7, if she can bake a decent pie. More laughter. Adelaide's nails dug into her palms hard enough that she might have drawn blood if she held long enough. She had survived battlefield hospitals during the war. She had held men together as they bled out beneath her hands. She would survive this too. $20. In silver. The voice wasn't particularly loud, but it cut through the crowd with unexpected authority. Every head turned. A man stood at the edge of the gathering, one arm cradling a small bundle. His clothes were plain, but clean. A simple cotton shirt rolled up at the sleeves, durable pants and boots that had seen their share of hard work. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a trimmed dark beard that didn't quite hide the stern set of his jaw. "That's Nathaniel Whitman," someone murmured, "the rancher from Wildrose Creek. His wife died last winter in childbirth." Adelaide allowed her gaze to drop from the horizon, meeting the stranger's eyes. Unlike the others, he didn't look at her with amusement or lecherous interest. Instead, there was something like recognition in his eyes, as if he'd been searching for her specifically. Frank Turner cleared his throat, surprised by the high bid. $20 from Mr. Whitman. Any other offers? Silence fell over the crowd. No one was willing to pay that much for a woman who couldn't bear children. "Sold, then!" Turner announced, the gavel falling with a crack that sealed Adelaide's fate. Nathaniel Whitman approached the platform. As he drew closer, Adelaide could see the bundle in his arms was an infant, perhaps 6 months old, with wisps of dark hair and solemn eyes that seemed too knowing for one so young. He looked up at Adelaide, his voice lowered, though many could still hear. "You're not merchandise, ma'am, but I have a daughter who needs care and a promise to keep." Something in his words caught her attention. A promise to whom? But before she could question it, he had paid Turner and was gesturing for her to follow him to a modest wagon parked at the edge of town. As they pulled away, Adelaide caught sight of Victor Caldwell watching them leave. His expression no longer satisfied, but calculating. The cold look in his eyes sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the spring breeze. The wagon rocked gently as they traveled the rutted road leading away from Wildrose Creek. Adelaide sat stiffly beside Nathaniel, her small carpet bag clutched in her lap, all that remained of her possessions. The baby Grace slept peacefully in a makeshift sling across Nathaniel's chest, untroubled by the bumpy journey. Adelaide found her eyes drawn repeatedly to the child's peaceful face, an ache blooming beneath her ribs that had become familiar over the years. They rode in silence for nearly an hour before Nathaniel spoke. "I know what that was back there," he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "It wasn't right. No person should be sold like cattle." Adelaide kept her gaze on the distant hills. "Yet you participated." Nathaniel's hands tightened on the reins. "Sometimes doing the right thing means working within a broken system." "And what is the right thing in your mind, Mr. Whitman? Purchasing a woman because she can cook and clean for you?" "No, ma'am." His voice remained steady. "Offering you a position with fair wages and your own room. You'll be my housekeeper and Grace's nurse if you're willing. If not, I'll help you get wherever you want to go." Adelaide turned to study his profile. "You're offering me a choice." "Everyone deserves a choice, Mrs. Sinclair." The use of her proper name startled her. Most people in town had taken to calling her Widow Sinclair, or simply the Barren One, after William's death. To hear her name spoken with respect felt like water to parched earth. As they crested a hill, the Whitman Ranch came into view. A modest but well-built house with a wraparound porch, a large barn, and several outbuildings spread across a valley embraced by rolling hills. Fields of young wheat stretched to the west, and a small herd of cattle grazed in a distant pasture. "It's not much," Nathaniel said, misinterpreting her silence for disappointment. "But it's peaceful." Adelaide wasn't disappointed. After months of living under Victor's cruel scrutiny, the isolated ranch looked like salvation. As Nathaniel helped her down from the wagon, her fingers brushed against his. She pulled away quickly, unused to the touch of a man after so long alone. If he noticed her discomfort, he gave no sign of it. "I'll show you to your room," he said, adjusting Grace against his chest. "You must be tired from the journey." The interior of the house surprised Adelaide. She had expected a bachelor's quarters, sparse and neglected. Instead, she found a home that had once been lovingly tended, but was now slowly surrendering to disorder. Dishes were stacked haphazardly beside a wash basin. Clean laundry lay half-folded on a table. Books and papers were scattered across nearly every surface. Her room was small, but private, located just off the kitchen. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt stood beneath a window that overlooked the eastern pasture. A simple dresser and washstand completed the furnishings. "It was my wife's sewing room," Nathaniel explained, lingering in the doorway. "Sophia, she would have wanted it used." The mention of his late wife hung in the air between them. Adelaide nodded, understanding the weight of the offering. "Thank you, Mr. Whitman." "Nate," he corrected. "If we're to share a home, formalities seem unnecessary." Adelaide placed her bag on the bed, marking her acceptance of the arrangement. "What are my duties to be, then?" "Grace needs the most attention. I've been managing, but—" He glanced down at his daughter with a mixture of love and helplessness. "She deserves better care than I can give while running the ranch. Beyond that, whatever help you're willing to provide with the house would be appreciated." He reached into his pocket and extracted several silver coins, placing them on the dresser. "Your first month's wages in advance. You've earned at least that much just by agreeing to come here." Before Adelaide could respond, Grace stirred against his chest, her small face scrunching in preparation for a cry. Nathaniel's expression shifted to one of barely concealed panic. "She'll be hungry," he said, bouncing the child awkwardly. "I should prepare her bottle." Adelaide followed him to the kitchen, watching as he struggled to measure milk powder into a bottle while keeping Grace from squirming out of his grip. His large hands, clearly accustomed to roping cattle and mending fences, seemed comically oversized for the delicate task. After the third attempt ended with milk powder dusting the floor, Adelaide stepped forward. "May I?" she asked, holding out her arms. Nathaniel hesitated only briefly before surrendering his daughter. The moment Adelaide cradled Grace against her chest, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. The baby's fussing quieted as she stared up at this new face with solemn curiosity. Adelaide felt a tightness in her throat. It had been so long since she'd held a child, not since the war, when she had cradled the infant son of a dying soldier promising to find the boy's mother. A promise she had kept, though it had nearly broken her, to deliver the child to a woman who would soon be a widow. Grace reached up her tiny fingers, grasping a strand of Adelaide's honey-colored hair that had escaped its pins. Instead of pulling, the baby simply held on, as if anchoring herself to this new person. "She likes you," Nathaniel said, surprise evident in his voice. "She usually cries with strangers." "Children know more than we give them credit for," Adelaide replied softly, allowing Grace to keep hold of her hair while Nathaniel successfully prepared the bottle. When he offered to take Grace back for feeding, Adelaide shook her head. "Show me how she likes to be held for her bottle." I should learn her routine, Nathaniel demonstrated, explaining Grace's preferences with the seriousness of a general outlining battle strategy. Adelaide listened carefully, absorbing every detail: how Grace preferred to be slightly reclined, how she sometimes needed the nipple adjusted mid-feeding, how she required gentle patting afterward to release trapped air. As night fell and the first stars appeared, Adelaide stood by the window in her new room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie. The vastness of the land around her was both intimidating and liberating after the confines of town. Through the thin wall, she could hear Nathaniel in the adjacent room, his deep voice softly singing to Grace. The melody was simple, slightly off-key, but filled with such tenderness that Adelaide felt like an intruder for overhearing it. She unpacked her meager belongings, 2 dresses besides the one she wore undergarments, carefully mended a hairbrush with several bristles missing, and a small leather-bound volume of poetry that had been William's gift on their first anniversary. At the bottom of her bag lay a flat wooden vase, which she placed carefully under her mattress. Inside were the few remnants of her former life she had managed to hide from Victor: William's pocket watch, her nursing medals from the war, and a small photograph of herself in her nurse's uniform standing beside William in his doctor's coat. Evidence of who she had been before loss and circumstance had reduced her to property to be auctioned. Sleep eluded her that night, her mind too full of questions. Why had Nathaniel Whitman really purchased her contract? What promise was he keeping? And why did she feel he knew more about her than he revealed? The next morning, Adelaide rose before dawn, her body remembering the rhythms of hospital life, even after years away from it. She dressed quietly and made her way to the kitchen, determined to establish her usefulness immediately. By the time Nathaniel appeared with Grace in his arms, Adelaide had a pot of coffee, brewing biscuits in the oven, and was turning bacon in a cast-iron skillet. He paused in the doorway, clearly surprised. "You didn't need to start so early." "Early rising is a habit I never broke," she replied, not looking up from her task. "Is Grace ready for her morning bottle?" The domestic routine established itself with surprising ease over the following days. Adelaide cared for Grace, restored order to the chaotic household, and prepared meals that made Nathaniel realize how poorly he had been feeding himself since Sophia's death. For his part, Nathaniel left at dawn each day to tend to ranch work, returning midday for a brief meal before heading out again until sunset. Their interactions were limited, polite, and focused primarily on Grace's needs and household matters. It was an arrangement that suited Adelaide. After the turbulence of the past years, the quiet rhythm of ranch life felt like a reprieve. Here, miles from town, no one whispered about her barrenness or questioned her worth as a woman. Here she could simply be useful. Grace proved to be an easy charge, a solemn, watchful baby who rarely cried without cause. She seemed content to observe Adelaide as she worked, her dark eyes following every movement from the makeshift cradle Nathaniel had placed in each room. It was during Grace's afternoon nap on her 5th day at the ranch that Adelaide finally had time to explore her new surroundings more thoroughly. The house itself was modest but solidly built. 4 rooms downstairs, including the kitchen sitting room, Nathaniel's study, and her bedroom. And 2 rooms upstairs, Nathaniel's bedroom and the nursery where Grace slept. In the study, Adelaide found bookshelves filled with an eclectic collection: agricultural journals, novels, poetry, and surprisingly, several medical texts. She ran her fingers along the spine of Gray's Anatomy, remembering how William had studied from a similar volume during their courtship. A small writing desk sat beneath the window papers scattered across its surface. Adelaide was careful not to disturb them, respecting Nathaniel's privacy, but she couldn't help noticing that many appeared to be letters, some sealed, some open, all addressed in the same strong handwriting. Curiosity tugged at her, but she resisted, turning instead to the collection of framed photographs on the mantelpiece. Most featured a beautiful dark-haired woman with a gentle smile. Sophia Whitman, she presumed. In one, Sophia stood beside Nathaniel, his hand resting protectively on her visibly pregnant form, both beaming with happiness. The sight caused an unexpected pang in Adelaide's chest. Not jealousy exactly, but a sharp reminder of what she would never experience. The joy of carrying a child, of creating life with someone who loved her. A sound from outside drew her attention. Through the window she saw an elderly man approaching on horseback, his back straight, despite his advanced years. Adelaide watched as Nathaniel emerged from the barn to greet him, the two men shaking hands with the familiarity of old friends. Curious, she moved to the kitchen window for a better view. The older man was dismounting with the careful movements of someone whose joints no longer obeyed as quickly as they once had. He carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. Adelaide quickly smoothed her apron and checked that her hair was properly pinned. If this was to be her first visitor in her new position, she wanted to appear competent and respectable. A few minutes later, Nathaniel's boots sounded on the porch steps, followed by the lighter tread of his companion. "Mrs. Sinclair," Nathaniel called, "there's someone I'd like you to meet." Adelaide stepped onto the porch, hands clasped before her. The elderly visitor studied her with keen blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing despite his age. "Adelaide Sinclair, this is Calvin Porter, our nearest neighbor," Nathaniel introduced. "Calvin, this is Mrs. Sinclair Grace's new nurse and our housekeeper." Calvin Porter tipped his hat, his weathered face creasing in a smile. "A pleasure, ma'am. Brought you some honey as a welcome gift. Best in the territory, if I do say so myself." He extended the package, and Adelaide accepted it with a small smile of her own. "Thank you, Mr. Porter. That's very kind. Calvin, please. We're informal out here on the frontier." His eyes held hers a moment longer than necessary, something like recognition flickering in their depths. "You have a nurse's posture, Mrs. Sinclair." The observation caught her off guard. "I beg your pardon. The way you stand, the way your eyes check everything, exits potential hazards, who needs attention first." Calvin nodded as if confirming something to himself. "Battlefield nurse, I'd wager. During the war." Adelaide felt the blood drain from her face. She glanced at Nathaniel, but his expression revealed nothing. "How did you know?" she asked softly. Calvin tapped his temple. "Served as a medical sergeant myself. You develop an eye for your own kind." He gestured to Nathaniel. "Just like I always said, our Nate here wasn't always a cattle rancher." This time it was Nathaniel who looked uncomfortable. "Calvin enjoys creating stories where there are none, Mrs. Sinclair. Don't let him trouble you." But Adelaide saw the flash of something in Nathaniel's eyes, a warning perhaps, or a plea for discretion. Calvin merely chuckled. "I'll leave you two to your secrets then. Just wanted to welcome the newest addition to our little corner of Nebraska." He turned to go, then paused. "Oh, and Nate, that fence on your north pasture won't hold through another storm. You might want to see to it soon." After Calvin departed, an awkward silence fell between Adelaide and Nathaniel. She was the first to break it. "He seems observant." Nathaniel sighed. "Calvin sees more than is good for him sometimes. But he's a loyal friend, and the best neighbor a person could ask for." Adelaide nodded, still processing Calvin's easy identification of her past. "Does everyone in the area know I was purchased?" "No," Nathaniel said firmly. "As far as anyone here knows, I hired you from town as Grace's nurse. Your private business is your own." And the consideration in this simple act of protection touched Adelaide unexpectedly. "Thank you," she said softly. Nathaniel looked away, seemingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I should get back to work. That north fence won't fix itself. As he strode toward the barn, Adelaide found herself watching him with new curiosity. Who was Nathaniel Whitman really? And what secrets was he keeping beneath his quiet exterior? That evening, after Grace had been fed and settled in her cradle, Adelaide found herself alone in her room earlier than usual. A restlessness had taken hold of her, sparked by Calvin Porter's observations and the questions they had raised. She lit the small lamp beside her bed and pulled out the worn poetry volume seeking comfort in familiar words. As she opened the book, a folded paper slipped from between its pages, not one she had placed there. Heart-quickening, Adelaide unfolded the letter. The handwriting was delicate feminine. The ink slightly faded, as if written months before. My dearest N, if you are reading this, then my fears have come to pass, and I have left you to raise our child alone. Forgive me for this final burden, but I must ask one more promise of you. Find Adelaide Sinclair. She is the nurse who saved your brother at Antietam, the one Daniel wrote about in his letters home. William Sinclair's wife. Sarah's cousin, my cousin, though she knows me only as Sophia now. I have tried to locate her these past months, but the war scattered so many families. If my suspicions are correct, she is with the Montgomerys in Cold Creek, though not happily so. She will be perfect for Grace. Perfect for you, though you may not see it yet. I go to meet our daughter, knowing you will keep this promise as you have kept all others. With eternal love. Adelaide's hands trembled as she read the letter a second time, then a third. Sarah. Her cousin Sarah, whom she had believed dead since '63, when their family home in Virginia had been destroyed. Sarah had become Sophia Whitman, and Sophia had known Adelaide's whereabouts, had been searching for her. But more shocking still, Nathaniel had known who she was before the auction. He had sought her out deliberately, fulfilling his wife's dying wish. A soft knock at her door startled Adelaide from her thoughts. She quickly folded the letter, sliding it beneath her pillow before calling, "Yes!" The door opened slightly, revealing Nathaniel's tall figure. "I apologize for disturbing you, but Grace is unsettled. I've tried everything I can think of." Adelaide rose immediately. "Of course. Let me see her." She followed him to the nursery, where Grace lay red-faced and wailing in her crib. Adelaide lifted the child, checking her diaper, and feeling for fever with practiced hands. "She's not ill," she determined, "and not hungry if she's had her evening bottle. Sometimes babies just need comfort." Adelaide settled into the rocking chair beside the window, cradling Grace against her shoulder. She began to hum softly an old lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child. The same lullaby she had hummed to wounded soldiers when morphine ran low and pain ran high. Gradually, Grace's cries subsided. The tiny body relaxed against Adelaide's shoulder, small fingers clutching at her collar. Nathaniel watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You have a way with her." Adelaide continued, rocking her voice low. "Children respond to calm. They know when they're safe." She paused, then added quietly, "Sarah used to love this song when we were children." The name hung in the air between them like a challenge. Nathaniel's sharp intake of breath was the only indication that he'd heard her. "You found the letter?" he said finally. "Yes." Adelaide kept her eyes on Grace, now sleeping peacefully against her. "Why didn't you tell me? Why the charade at the auction?" Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration or perhaps uncertainty. "I didn't know how to approach you. When I learned Victor Caldwell planned to sell you publicly, He trailed off, jaw tightening. "It seemed the simplest way to get you away from there." "You could have introduced yourself. explained about Sarah, Sophia. Would you have believed me? A stranger claiming your long-lost cousin was my dead wife? He shook his head. I made the decision I thought best at the time. Adelaide couldn't argue with his logic, but the deception still stung. How much do you know about me? Only what Sophia told me. That you were a nurse during the war. That you married a doctor named William Sinclair. That you were family she had lost track of after her parents moved west and changed their name to avoid the fighting. He hesitated, then continued. And I know my brother Daniel wrote about you in his letters home. The golden-haired angel who saved his arm at Antietam when other surgeons wanted to amputate. Adelaide's breath caught. So many connections previously invisible now revealed like a complex tapestry. Daniel Whitman, she whispered, memory stirring. Young lieutenant, shrapnel wound to the shoulder that had turned septic. You remember him? Nathaniel sounded surprised. I remember all of them. The words came out more harshly than she intended. Every man I couldn't save. Every one I could. Grace stirred at the edge in her voice, and Adelaide resumed rocking, forcing herself to calm. Daniel survived his wounds, Nathaniel said quietly. He died of typhoid fever 6 months later. But he never forgot what you did for him. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the soft creaking of the rocking chair and Grace's gentle breathing. I should have told you, Nathaniel finally said. I'm sorry for the deception. Adelaide nodded, accepting his apology, though not quite ready to forgive it. We all have our secrets, Mr. Whitman. Some we keep to protect others. Some we keep to protect ourselves. She rose carefully, transferring the sleeping Grace to her crib with practiced ease. As she straightened, she found Nathaniel watching her with an intensity that made her look away. I should return to my room, she said quietly. Good night, Mr. Whitman. As she slipped past him in the doorway, he spoke again, his voice barely audible. For what it's worth, Mrs. Sinclair, Sophia was right about you. You are exactly what Grace needs. Adelaide paused, but did not turn. And what about what I need, Mr. Whitman? Did either of you consider that? She didn't wait for his answer, continuing down the hallway to her room, the letter still hidden beneath her pillow like a stone weighing down her dreams. The following days brought a fragile new understanding between Adelaide and Nathaniel. Neither mentioned the letter again, but its contents hovered in the air during their brief interactions, a shared knowledge that both connected and separated them. Adelaide threw herself into her duties with renewed vigor, as if proving her worth through service might somehow balance the scales of Nathaniel's deception. She scoured the house from top to bottom, prepared meals that drew rare compliments from her employer, and tended to Grace with meticulous care. For his part, Nathaniel seemed to make a concerted effort to be more present. He returned from the fields earlier, spent more time with Grace, and occasionally attempted conversation beyond the day's necessities. It was during one such evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson, that Adelaide first glimpsed the man beneath the stoic rancher. Grace had fallen asleep in Adelaide's arms, her small face peaceful in repose. Nathaniel sat in the adjoining chair, whittling a small wooden figure, another animal for the collection he was creating for his daughter. She favors her mother, Adelaide observed, studying Grace's delicate features. Nathaniel's hands stilled. Yes, sometimes I look at her and see Sophia so clearly it takes my breath away. He resumed his carving the knife, moving in controlled strokes. Do you see Sarah in her, your cousin? Adelaide considered the sleeping child. Perhaps around the eyes. Sarah and I weren't close as children, She was several years older. By the time I was old enough to really know her, her family had moved west. She hesitated, then asked, "How did you meet her?" A ghost of a smile touched Nathaniel's lips. "In St. Louis. I was between occupations. She was teaching at a small school there." The smile faded. "After Daniel died, I wasn't in a good place. Sophia, Sarah." She had a way of making a person believe in tomorrow again. The raw emotion in his voice touched something in Adelaide. Despite her lingering resentment over his deception, she couldn't help but recognize the genuine grief of a man who had loved deeply. "William was like that," she offered, surprised at her own willingness to share. "Always looking forward, never dwelling on what couldn't be changed." "Your husband sounds like a good man." "He was." Adelaide stroked Grace's downy hair, finding comfort in the simple touch. "We met during the war. I was assigned to his field hospital after Antietam. He proposed 6 months later, amid a typhoid outbreak." "Not the most romantic setting," Nathaniel observed. Adelaide smiled faintly. "William said there was no point waiting for perfect circumstances in a world that offered so few guarantees." Her smile faded. "After the war, we tried to build a normal life. When it became clear I couldn't have children, he never once made me feel lacking." She hadn't meant to reveal so much, especially about her barrenness. The admission hung in the air between them, intimate and vulnerable. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, "No decent man would." The simple statement, delivered without pity or judgment, eased something tight in Adelaide's chest. For so long, her inability to bear children had defined her in the eyes of others. A flaw, a failure, a reason to discard her. Nathaniel's matter-of-fact acceptance felt like permission to see herself as whole, despite what she lacked. The moment was interrupted by a distant rumble of thunder. Nathaniel glanced at the horizon where dark clouds were gathering, despite the colorful sunset. "Storm's coming," he observed. "Looks to be a big one." Adelaide rose, cradling the still sleeping Grace. "I should put her to bed before it hits. She doesn't like thunder." As she turned to go inside, Nathaniel's voice stopped her. "Mrs. Sinclair, Adelaide, thank you." "For what?" "For being here. For caring for Grace as if—" He trailed off, seemingly unable to find the right words. "As if she were my own," Adelaide supplied quietly. Nathaniel met her gaze, his eyes reflecting the fading light. "Yes." Adelaide looked down at the child in her arms, feeling the warm weight of her, the absolute trust in the way Grace slept against her shoulder. "Some bonds don't require blood, Mr. Whitman," she said softly. "Good night." As she carried Grace inside, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, bringing with them the scent of wet earth and the promise of renewal. Behind her, Nathaniel remained on the porch, a solitary figure watching the approaching storm. A man with secrets of his own that had yet to be revealed. The letter Adelaide had found was just the beginning. As lightning split the darkening sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that greater revelations awaited, and that the storm on the horizon was both literal and figurative, promising to wash away pretenses and leave only raw truth in its wake. The storm that night raged with biblical fury. Rain lashed against the windows of the Whitman homestead, turning the dirt yard to mud, and the creek at the property's edge into a roaring torrent. Wind howled through the eaves, its voice like a woman's mournful keening. Adelaide stood at her bedroom window, watching nature's violence unfold across the darkened prairie. Lightning flashed, illuminating the landscape in harsh white bursts that revealed bent trees and windswept fields. In those brief moments of illumination, the familiar world transformed into something alien and threatening. She had always found comfort in storms. During the war, Thunderstorms had sometimes silenced the artillery, giving both sides a forced reprieve. She had delivered babies' amputated limbs and comforted the dying during such heavenly interventions, finding strange peace in nature's ability to halt even mankind's most determined efforts at destruction. A particularly violent thunderclap shook the house, followed immediately by the sound of Grace crying from the nursery upstairs. Adelaide grabbed her shawl, wrapping it around her nightdress as she hurried toward the stairs. She met Nathaniel in the hallway, his hair tousled from sleep, a lamp held high in one hand. "I'll see to her," Adelaide said softly. Nathaniel nodded, relief evident in his face. "Thank you. I should check the barn anyway. The new foal might be frightened. In this weather, surely it can wait until morning." "Animals don't understand waiting," he replied with a wry smile. "Don't worry, I've weathered worse storms than this." As he turned toward the back door, Adelaide called after him, "Be careful, Mr. Whitman." He paused, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read in the lamplight. "Always am, Mrs. Sinclair." Upstairs, Grace had worked herself into a state of panic, her tiny face red with exertion. Adelaide lifted her from the crib, cradling her close. "Shh, little one. It's just the angels rearranging furniture," she whispered, using the explanation her own mother had given for thunder during childhood storms. She settled into the rocking chair by the window, wrapping her shawl around both of them. Grace's cries gradually subsided as Adelaide rocked and hummed the child's warm weight against her chest, a peculiar comfort amid the storm's chaos. Through the rain-streaked window, she could make out Nathaniel's figure crossing the yard, head bent against the wind, as he made his way to the barn. Lightning flashed again, throwing his silhouette into sharp relief. A solitary man, fighting the elements, stubbornly carrying out his duty, despite nature's opposition. There was something in his determined stride that reminded Adelaide of William during the war. The same quiet resolve, the same unwavering commitment to those in his care. The comparison came unbidden and unwelcome. She had promised herself she would not look for her dead husband in another man. Yet, as she watched Nathaniel disappear into the darkness, she couldn't help but wonder about the secrets he carried. What had Calvin Porter meant about Nathaniel not always being a cattle rancher? What past had he left behind to build this isolated life on the Nebraska frontier? Grace had fallen back asleep, her breathing deep and even against Adelaide's neck. Still, Adelaide continued rocking, reluctant to return the child to her crib, only to have her wake again at the next thunderclap. The storm showed no signs of abating. Rain continued to hammer the roof, and the wind's moans rose and fell like ghostly conversation. Adelaide lost track of time, lulled by the rocking chair's steady motion and Grace's warm weight. Her thoughts drifted to the letter hidden beneath her pillow downstairs. Sarah, her cousin Sarah, whom she had believed dead since '63, had become Sophia Whitman, had lived here in this very house, had rocked in this very chair, perhaps, watching storms just like this one sweep across the prairie. And now Sarah was gone, leaving behind a husband, a daughter, and a final wish that had brought Adelaide here. The coincidence seemed too great to be mere chance. Was it fate, divine intervention, or simply the desperate act of a dying woman reaching out through time to connect the broken pieces of her family? A particularly loud crash of thunder jolted Adelaide from her reverie. Grace stirred, but didn't wake. Adelaide glanced out the window again, realizing with a start that Nathaniel had been gone far longer than checking on a foal should require. Unease prickled along her spine. The storm had worsened, and the barn was a good 100 yards from the house. What if something had happened? What if Nathaniel was injured or worse? Adelaide carefully rose from the rocking chair, mindful not to disturb Grace. She placed the sleeping child back in her crib, tucking the blankets securely around her. After a moment's hesitation, she positioned pillows on either side of the infant, not so close as to pose a danger, but enough to make Grace feel secure if she woke. Downstairs, Adelaide retrieved her sturdiest boots and William's old oilskin coat from her trunk. The garment was far too large, but it would keep the worst of the rain off. She lit a lantern, steeling herself for the dash across the muddy yard. The moment she opened the door, the wind nearly tore it from her grasp. Rain struck her face like needles, and her lantern flickered precariously. Ducking her head, Adelaide stepped into the tempest. The yard had become a quagmire, mud sucking at her boots with each step. She kept her eyes fixed on the barn, its dark shape barely visible through the curtain of rain. Lightning flashed, momentarily blinding her. The thunder that followed was immediate and deafening, suggesting the storm was directly overhead. By the time Adelaide reached the barn, she was soaked, despite the oilskin coat. She struggled with the heavy wooden door, finally managing to heave it open enough to slip inside. "Mr. Whitman," she called, raising her lantern. "Nathaniel." The barn was eerily quiet compared to the chaos outside. The familiar smells of hay, horse, and leather surrounded her. Animals shifted nervously in their stalls, eyes reflecting the lantern light like scattered coins in the darkness. "Here." The voice came from the far end of the barn, near the foaling stall. Adelaide made her way toward it, picking her path carefully between stacked hay bales and farm implements. She found Nathaniel kneeling beside a young mare, his shirt sleeves rolled up past his elbows, arms covered in blood up to the forearms. The horse lay on her side in the straw sides, heaving eyes rolling in distress. "The foal is turned wrong," Nathaniel explained without looking up, his voice tight with concentration. "I've been trying to reposition it, but—" Adelaide set down her lantern and shrugged off the oilskin coat. Without a word, she knelt beside him in the straw, assessing the situation with a medical professional's detachment. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the laboring animal. Nathaniel hesitated only briefly before nodding and moving aside. Adelaide rolled up her sleeves momentarily, forgetting the scar on her left arm that she usually kept carefully hidden. She worked methodically, her hands gentle but firm as they explored the mare's birth canal. Years of medical training took over, pushing aside any squeamishness or hesitation. "The foal's front leg is bent back," she murmured. "That's why it won't come. I need to straighten it before she can deliver." Nathaniel watched in silence as Adelaide maneuvered her arm deeper into the mare face, set in concentration. Her movements were precise, confident, the actions of someone who had performed far more complex medical procedures under far worse conditions. Minutes stretched like hours as Adelaide worked. The mare whinnied in distress, but Nathaniel kept her calm with soft words and a steady hand on her neck. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the barn, another kind of battle was being waged, one against nature's occasional cruelty, against death's constant lurking presence. "There," Adelaide said, finally, satisfaction evident in her voice. "The leg is straightened. Now we need to help her push." Together they positioned themselves to assist the mare. Adelaide gave quiet instructions which Nathaniel followed without question. Their hands worked in tandem, bloody, but sure, strangers united in the ancient human effort to bring forth life rather than witness death. When the foal finally slid into the world, wet and gangly and perfect, Adelaide felt a rush of elation she hadn't experienced since her nursing days. The small creature lay still for a heart-stopping moment, then shuddered and took its first breath. "It's a filly," Nathaniel said softly, a rare smile breaking across his face. "A beautiful filly." Adelaide sat back on her heels, suddenly aware of her sodden clothes, the straw sticking to her skirts, and the blood coating her arms. She felt Nathaniel's eyes on her and looked up to find him watching her with undisguised admiration. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. Adelaide nodded, her professional composure beginning to crack as exhaustion set in. "Many times. During the war, farm animals were often as important to a regiment's survival as the soldiers themselves. When the veterinary officers were overwhelmed, medical staff stepped in. You're full of surprises, Mrs. Sinclair." Nathaniel's voice was soft, almost reverent. Before she could respond, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the barn doors. They both glanced toward the sound, reminded of the storm still raging outside. "We should stay here until it passes," Nathaniel decided. "The mare and foal need monitoring anyway." Adelaide nodded her agreement, too tired to contemplate a return journey through the mud and rain. They worked side by side to make the new mother and baby comfortable, spreading fresh straw and ensuring the foal was nursing properly. When there was nothing more to be done, Nathaniel brought over a horse blanket and offered it to Adelaide. "You're soaked through. Take this before you catch your death." She accepted the blanket, gratefully wrapping it around her shoulders. They settled on a hay bale near the foaling stall, the lantern between them casting long shadows against the barn walls. "You risked a great deal coming out in this weather," Nathaniel observed after a moment of companionable silence. "Grace would have been alone if something had happened to both of us." Adelaide hadn't considered that. The realization sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. "I didn't think. I was worried when you didn't return." Nathaniel studied her in the lantern light, his expression unreadable. The question hung between them, deceptively simple yet fraught with implication. Why indeed had she risked herself for a man who was in essence still a stranger, an employer who had deceived her, however well-intentioned his motives might have been, because no one should face a storm alone? She answered finally, the truth simpler than she had expected. Nathaniel held her gaze for a long moment, something shifting in his eyes. Then he nodded, accepting her answer without pressing further. They lapsed into silence again, listening to the rain drumming on the barn roof and the occasional soft nickering of the mare to her foal. Despite the discomfort of wet clothes and the hard surface of the hay bale, Adelaide felt a strange peace settle over her. "I was a doctor," Nathaniel said suddenly, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Before all this. During the war." Adelaide turned to look at him, but his gaze was fixed on the mare and foal. His profile in the lantern light was sharp, shadowed the face of a man revealing something long buried. "Not just a doctor," he continued, "a surgeon with the 8th Illinois Cavalry, under a different name." "Dr. Nathan Gray," Adelaide whispered, the name surfacing from the depths of memory. "You were at Antietam. You worked alongside William." Nathaniel, Nathan, looked at her, then surprise evident in his face. "You knew, not until this moment. But William spoke of a Dr. Gray often, a brilliant surgeon who performed miracles under impossible conditions." She paused, piecing together fragments of recollection. "You disappeared after Gettysburg. William said you'd suffered some kind of breakdown, that no one knew what had become of you." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Not a breakdown. A reckoning." He drew a deep breath as if the words physically pained him. "I made a decision during the battle. Triage. Who to save. Who to make comfortable. Who to leave to fate. Standard procedure in field hospitals." Adelaide nodded. She knew the terrible calculus of battlefield medicine all too well. There was a lieutenant badly wounded, gut shot. By all measures he should have been made comfortable and moved to the dying tent. But he reminded me of my brother. Same age, same eyes. Nathaniel's voice had grown hollow. "I chose to operate on him instead of a sergeant with a more survivable chest wound. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken consequences. The lieutenant died anyway, Nathaniel finally continued, and so did the sergeant, who might have lived if I'd chosen differently. 23 men died under my care that day, but those two— He shook his head. Those two broke something in me. I couldn't trust my judgment anymore. Couldn't separate the doctor from the man. Adelaide understood then, of the weight he carried, the reason he had abandoned medicine for the isolation of a Nebraska cattle ranch. She had seen it happen to other doctors during the war. Some wounds weren't visible. Some scars ran deeper than flesh. "So you left?" she said softly. "Changed your name. Started over." William helped. He arranged papers, a new identity. Said I'd done more good than harm, but deserved peace if I couldn't believe that myself. Nathaniel's hands resting on his knees curled into fists. I promised I'd never practice medicine again, that I'd never put myself in a position to make those kinds of choices. Yet you just helped deliver a foal, Adelaide pointed out gently. You keep medical texts in your study, and Calvin mentioned your medical supplies. Old habits, Nathaniel admitted. Out here, sometimes there's no one else. I've limited myself to veterinary concerns and minor human ailments. Nothing that forces me to choose. Adelaide considered his confession, understanding now the reason for his initial panic when Grace had fallen ill. Not just a father's fear for his child, but a former doctor's terror of facing another impossible choice, of failing again at what had once defined him. Outside, the storm's fury had begun to subside. The rain still fell, but the thunder had grown distant, the wind less insistent. Nature's rage, like all things, eventually spent itself. "We all carry ghosts, Nathaniel," Adelaide said, finally deliberately using his chosen name rather than the one from his past. "We all have moments we would change, if we could." He looked at her, then really looked at her, as if seeing past the wet clothes and disheveled hair to something essential beneath. "And your ghosts, Adelaide, what form do they take?" The question was intimate, more personal than any he had asked before. In the strange liminality of the storm-shadowed barn, with a newborn foal's first hours unfolding beside them, truth seemed easier to bear than at other times. "I couldn't save them all either," she admitted quietly. "But it wasn't the ones who died that haunt me most. It's the ones I saved only partially. The men who left my care alive but broken, missing limbs, eyes, pieces of themselves they'd never get back." Her hand unconsciously moved to her left arm, fingers tracing the outline of the scar beneath her sleeve. "And there was a woman during the Wilderness campaign, a local pregnant caught in the crossfire when her village was shelled. William and I tried to save her and the baby, but—" Adelaide closed her eyes, the memory still vivid after all these years. "The shell fragment that killed her also wounded me. Not badly compared to what others suffered, but enough to ensure I would never carry a child myself." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and unvarnished. Adelaide hadn't spoken of it aloud since William's death. In Cold Creek, her barrenness had been whispered about, speculated upon, but never discussed openly, a shameful secret rather than a war wound. "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said simply. Adelaide opened her eyes to find him watching her with compassion, untainted by pity. "As am I," she replied. "Not just for myself, but for the children I'll never have." "Grace adores you," he offered quietly. "And you clearly care for her." "It's not the same." "No," he agreed. "But perhaps it's its own kind of blessing." The mare nickered softly to her foal, drawing their attention. The small creature had managed to stand on wobbly legs, and was now nursing tail swishing with contentment. "Life finds a way," Nathaniel murmured almost to himself. Then with more certainty, "What will you name her?" Adelaide blinked, surprised. "Me, surely. That's your right as the owner. You brought her into this world. The privilege is yours." Adelaide studied the newborn filly, dark like her mother with a white star between her eyes and one white sock on her right foreleg. In the lantern light, her coat gleamed like polished mahogany. "Hope," Adelaide decided. "Her name is Hope." Nathaniel nodded satisfaction in his expression. "A good name. A strong name." They sat in companionable silence after that, watching mother and daughter, two people who had shared more of themselves in one storm-tossed night than in all the days preceding it. The rain continued to fall gentler now, a soothing backdrop to the miracle of new life before them. When Nathaniel finally spoke again, his voice had regained its usual steady timbre. "The storm's passing. We should return to the house before Grace wakes." Adelaide nodded, suddenly aware of her exhaustion. Her clothes had begun to dry, but she felt chilled to the bone, her muscles aching from the tension of the delivery and the emotional toll of their shared confidences. As they prepared to leave, Nathaniel surprised her by removing his own coat and draping it over her shoulders, adding a layer of warmth over the horse blanket. "I've already risked pneumonia once tonight," she protested weakly. "Then it would be foolish to risk it twice." He countered his tone, brooking no argument. They made their way back to the house through thinning rain and mud that sucked at their boots with each step. Nathaniel insisted on holding the lantern, its golden light guiding their path through the storm's aftermath. At the porch steps, Adelaide paused, turning to look back at the barn, where so much had been revealed. "Will you check on Hope in the morning?" Nathaniel followed her gaze. "We both will, if you'd like." "I would," she said softly. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "Thank you for trusting me with your past." He studied her in the lantern-light, raindrops glistening in his beard and hair. "Thank you for not judging it." They entered the house, quietly mindful of the sleeping child upstairs. At the foot of the stairs they would part ways, Adelaide to her small room off the kitchen, Nathaniel to the upper floor where Grace slept. "Good night, Nathaniel," Adelaide said deliberately, using his chosen name again, a small acknowledgement of the trust he had placed in her. "Good night, Adelaide," he replied, the formal barriers between employer and employee, widower and widow crumbling a little more with each utterance of their given names. As Adelaide closed her bedroom door behind her, she felt subtly altered, as if the storm had washed away some outer layer of herself, revealing something newer and more vulnerable beneath. She changed into dry clothes with mechanical movements, her mind still in the barn, with Nathaniel's confession and her own unexpected revelations. She had not intended to speak of her wound, of the true reason for her barrenness. It had been easier in some ways to let people believe she was simply defective, cursed as Victor had claimed, rather than explain the battlefield injury that had taken not just her fertility, but her faith in a just and merciful God. Yet Nathaniel had understood, without judgment, had seen her scars, both visible and hidden, as badges of survival rather than marks of shame. In his eyes, she had glimpsed not pity but recognition, the understanding of one wounded healer for another. As she slipped beneath her quilt, Adelaide realized she had forgotten to check on the letter hidden under her pillow. It seemed less important now somehow. The connection between her and Nathaniel was no longer defined solely by Sarah Sophia's final wish, but by something they had forged themselves in the crucible of shared confidence. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. In its place, a profound stillness settled over the prairie, the exhausted peace that follows nature's violence. Adelaide closed her eyes, surrendering to sleep, with the image of a newborn foal taking its first wobbling steps toward life. The next morning dawned clear and brilliant, the storm's fury replaced by a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wet earth and new growth. Adelaide woke earlier than usual, her body stiff from the previous night's exertions, but her mind surprisingly clear. Grace was already awake when Adelaide checked the nursery, babbling happily in her crib, seemingly unaffected by the night's tumult. After changing and feeding the baby, Adelaide carried her downstairs, determined to begin the day's routine despite her lingering fatigue. She was surprised to find Nathaniel already in the kitchen, coffee brewing on the stove and bacon sizzling in a cast-iron skillet. "You're cooking," she observed, unable to keep the astonishment from her voice. Nathaniel glanced over his shoulder, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "I managed to feed myself before you arrived, you know. Not particularly well, I'll admit, but I didn't starve." Adelaide settled Grace in her high chair, securing her with a small blanket. "I didn't mean to imply otherwise. I'm just surprised to see you inside at this hour. I thought you'd be checking on Hope." "Already done," he replied, sliding the bacon onto a waiting plate. "Mother and daughter are doing well. I thought you might want to rest this morning, considering—" He trailed off, suddenly awkward, as if unsure how to reference their shared experience in the barn, both the foal's delivery and the confidences exchanged afterward. "I'm quite well, thank you," Adelaide assured him, moving to take over the cooking. "I've worked through far worse fatigue during the war." Their hands brushed as she reached for the spatula, a brief contact that should have been inconsequential, but instead sent an unexpected warmth up her arm. Nathaniel stepped back quickly, as if he too had felt something unexpected in the casual touch. "I should see to the fence line," he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. "The storm likely did some damage." Adelaide nodded, not trusting herself to speak immediately. When she did, she kept her tone deliberately light. "Grace and I will visit Hope later, if that's all right." "Of course. The filly should meet her namesake." At Adelaide's questioning look, he elaborated, "Sophia always said Grace was our hope for the future. It seems fitting they should know each other." With that, he took his coffee and headed for the door, pausing only briefly to brush a gentle hand over Grace's dark curls. Adelaide watched him go, struck by the casual tenderness of the gesture and the growing certainty that Nathaniel Whitman was not at all the stern, withdrawn rancher she had initially believed him to be. The day passed in a rhythm now familiar to Adelaide, tending to Grace, managing household tasks, preparing meals. Yet beneath this routine flowed an undercurrent of something new, a shift in the atmosphere of the house itself. The walls that had once seemed to echo with unspoken grief now held fresher memories. Confidences, shared understanding reached small moments of connection that gradually rewove the torn fabric of two damaged lives. In the afternoon, as promised, Adelaide bundled Grace up and carried her to the barn to meet the newborn filly. Hope had gained strength overnight now, standing steadily beside her mother, all impossibly long legs and curious eyes. "Look, Grace," Adelaide murmured, holding the baby where she could see the foal. "That's Hope. She's just a baby like you." Grace regarded the filly with solemn interest, then broke into a delighted smile when Hope tentatively approached, sniffing at this strange new creature. The mare watched warily, but made no move to intervene. "They recognize something in each other," came Nathaniel's voice from the barn entrance. Adelaide turned to find him leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the scene with undisguised pleasure. "Innocence, perhaps," Adelaide suggested. "Neither yet knows the world's cruelty." "Or its beauty," Nathaniel countered, pushing away from the door and approaching slowly, mindful not to startle the animals. They've yet to see a sunrise over the prairie or wildflowers blooming after a spring rain. Adelaide looked at him in mild surprise. "I wouldn't have taken you for a poet, Mr. Whitman." A faint flush colored his cheeks above his beard. "Hardly that. Just a man who's learned to appreciate small mercies." They stood together watching as Hope grew bolder, stretching her neck toward Grace. The baby reached out a tiny hand, not quite touching the velvety muzzle, but clearly enchanted by the creature before her. "She has your curiosity," Nathaniel observed. "Grace, she's not mine, Nathaniel." "Biologically, no. But she watches the world the way you do, taking everything in, missing nothing." His voice softened. "Children learn more than words and manners from those who raise them. They absorb ways of being, of seeing." Adelaide hadn't considered this, the notion that she might be shaping Grace in ways beyond the physical care she provided. The thought was both frightening and oddly comforting. "I'm not her mother." She felt compelled to clarify, though, whether for Nathaniel's benefit or her own, she couldn't say. "No," he agreed. "Sophia was her mother, and always will be. But Grace needs more than memories. She needs a living example of what a woman can be." The compliment, if that's what it was, left Adelaide momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a response, the sound of an approaching wagon drifted through the open barn door. Nathaniel frowned. "We're not expecting deliveries today." They moved together to the barn entrance, Adelaide still carrying Grace, who protested at being taken away from her new friend. Outside, a smart buggy pulled by a well-groomed bay was coming up the drive, driven by a woman whose vibrant red shawl stood out like a flame against the prairie's muted palette. "Rebecca Martinez." Nathaniel identified, his frown deepening. "Sophia's friend from town, the midwife." Adelaide felt a sudden irrational flutter of anxiety. She had known intellectually that eventually she would need to interact with the people from Nathaniel's past, people who had known Sophia, who might resent her presence in the Whitman household. Rebecca Martinez drew her buggy to a halt in the yard, setting the brake with practiced efficiency before descending. She was younger than Adelaide had expected, perhaps 30, with the striking features of mixed heritage, her Spanish ancestry evident in her dark eyes and proud carriage, though her hair was a rich auburn rather than the expected black. "Nathaniel," she called, her voice carrying a faint accent. "I came as soon as the roads were passable. Is Grace well after the storm?" Her gaze fell on Adelaide and the child in her arms, and something flickered across her expressive face. Surprise, assessment, and perhaps a hint of disapproval. "Rebecca," Nathaniel greeted, stepping forward. "Grace is fine, as you can see. May I introduce Mrs. Adelaide Sinclair? She's Grace's nurse and our housekeeper." Rebecca's eyebrows rose slightly. "Nurse, I wasn't aware you had hired someone." The emphasis on hired was subtle but unmistakable. Adelaide straightened her spine, years of dealing with dismissive doctors and skeptical patients coming to her aid. "Miss Martinez," she acknowledged with a polite nod. "A pleasure to meet you. Grace has just been visiting a new foal born during last night's storm." Rebecca approached, her attention now fixed on the baby. "Hello, little one," she crooned, her entire demeanor softening. "Do you remember your tia Rebecca?" Grace regarded the newcomer solemnly for a moment, then broke into a smile, reaching for the bright shawl with evident fascination. Rebecca laughed, a warm, rich sound, and tickled Grace's chin. "She's grown so much since I last saw her," she remarked, then added with a pointed glance at Nathaniel. "Which has been far too long. You should bring her to town more often." "The ranch keeps me busy," Nathaniel replied, a hint of defensiveness in his tone. "Too busy for your friends, for people who care about Grace." Rebecca shook her head disapprovingly. "Sophia would not want you to become a hermit, Nathaniel." Adelaide felt suddenly intrusive. witnessing what was clearly a conversation laden with history and unspoken tensions. "Perhaps I should take Grace inside for her nap," she suggested, already turning toward the house. "Actually, I'd like to examine her if you don't mind," Rebecca said smoothly, intercepting Adelaide's retreat. "I promised Sophia I would look after her daughter's health." The statement carried an unmistakable message. "I have a connection to this child that predates yours. I knew her mother. I belong here in a way you do not." Nathaniel must have sensed the undercurrents, for he intervened with gentle firmness. "Grace is in excellent health, Rebecca. Mrs. Sinclair has been providing exemplary care." Rebecca's dark eyes assessed Adelaide more thoroughly, noting her straight posture, capable hands, and the confident way she held Grace. "You have experience with children, Mrs. Sinclair." "I was a nurse during the war," Adelaide answered simply. "I've cared for patients of all ages." Something shifted in Rebecca's expression, not quite approval, but a grudging reassessment. "A nurse? Well, that's unexpected. Sophia would be pleased that Grace has proper medical attention available." The mention of Sophia, Sarah, sent a pang through Adelaide's chest. This woman had known her cousin in ways Adelaide never would, had shared confidences and friendship with a person Adelaide had believed long dead. "You were close to Mrs. Whitman?" she asked, unable to help herself. Rebecca's smile turned wistful. "Since she first arrived in the territory. We met when I was assisting my mother. She was the midwife before me, with a difficult birth. Sophia was teaching the farmers' children and stayed to help. We became friends instantly." Her gaze shifted to Nathaniel. "She was the kindest soul I've ever known." "Yes," Nathaniel agreed quietly. "She was." An awkward silence fell heavy with grief and memory. Grace, oblivious to the emotional undercurrents, began to fuss, rubbing her eyes with tiny fists. "She is tired," Rebecca observed. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside while she naps." Adelaide looked to Nathaniel, uncertain of her place in this reunion of old friends. He nodded almost imperceptibly, a silent permission for her to remain included. "I'll prepare some coffee," Adelaide offered, leading the way toward the house. Inside, she settled Grace in her downstairs cradle, tucking the blanket around her with practiced care. The child was asleep, almost instantly exhausted from the excitement of meeting Hope and Rebecca's arrival. In the kitchen, Adelaide busied herself with coffee preparations, listening as Nathaniel and Rebecca engaged in quiet conversation in the adjoining sitting room. Their voices were too low to distinguish words, but the familiarity of their interaction was evident even in their muted tones. When she entered carrying a tray with coffee and the fresh biscuits she'd baked that morning, Rebecca was examining a small object Nathaniel had handed her. A carved wooden horse similar to the one he had been working on the night of the storm. "Your skill improves," Rebecca was saying, turning the carving in her slender fingers. "Sophia always said you had an artist's hands." Nathaniel accepted the compliment with a nod, taking the horse back and placing it on the mantelpiece alongside several other wooden animals, a growing collection for Grace. Adelaide served the coffee, then took a seat slightly apart from the others, still unsure of her role in this reunion. Rebecca stirred sugar into her cup, studying Adelaide over the rim as she took a sip. "These biscuits are excellent, Mrs. Sinclair," she said after sampling one. "You've brought many improvements to the Whitman household, I see." "Adelaide has been a blessing," Nathaniel confirmed, using her given name with a casualness that clearly surprised Rebecca. "For both Grace and myself." Rebecca's eyebrows rose slightly. "Indeed." She turned to Adelaide, her expression now openly curious. "And how did you come to be here, Mrs. Sinclair? Nathaniel has never mentioned seeking a housekeeper." The question hung in the air, innocent on its surface, but probing beneath. Adelaide glanced at Nathaniel, uncertain how much of their unusual arrangement he wished to reveal. He met her gaze steadily, then addressed Rebecca himself. Adelaide came to us through unusual circumstances. She was Sarah's cousin. Rebecca's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Sarah, Sophia's birth name, Nathaniel clarified, before her family moved west and changed their identity to avoid the war. Rebecca set her cup down with a clatter, eyes wide. Sophia never mentioned a cousin. She told me her entire family had died in Virginia. She believed they had, Adelaide explained softly, just as I believed Sarah had perished when our family home was destroyed in '63. This is quite extraordinary, Rebecca said, looking between them. How did you discover this connection? Nathaniel and Adelaide exchanged glances again, a silent communication passing between them. How much should they reveal? The letter, the deliberate search that had led Nathaniel to the auction block. It's a long story, Nathaniel finally said. But the important thing is that Adelaide is family. Sophia's family. Which makes her Grace's family, too. Rebecca absorbed this, her intelligent eyes missing nothing of the unspoken currents between Nathaniel and Adelaide. Family, she repeated thoughtfully. Yes, I can see how that would be significant. She turned her full attention to Adelaide, then her manner warming perceptibly. Sophia often spoke of wishing Grace could know her extended family. She would be pleased, I think, to know her cousin is caring for her daughter. The acceptance, however qualified, eased something in Adelaide's chest. I wish I had known her as Sophia, the woman she became. She was remarkable, Rebecca said with genuine feeling. Strong, intelligent, compassionate. She made this territory a better place during her short time here. She certainly made my life better, Nathaniel added quietly. A melancholy silence followed, broken only when Grace stirred in her cradle, making the small mewling sounds that preceded waking. Adelaide rose automatically, but Rebecca was faster, moving to the cradle with the confidence of someone who had tended this child before. "Hello, sunshine," she cooed, lifting Grace with practiced ease. "Did you have sweet dreams?" Adelaide sank back into her chair, watching as Rebecca competently checked Grace's diaper and smoothed her rumpled dress. The easy familiarity of her actions was a reminder that Adelaide, despite the connection of blood, was still the newcomer in Grace's life. "She's growing so well," Rebecca observed, bringing Grace back to the sitting area. "You've done a fine job with her, Nathaniel." "Adelaide deserves the credit these past weeks," he replied. "Grace has thrived under her care." Rebecca glanced between them again, something calculating in her expression. "Yes, I can see that." She bounced Grace gently on her knee. "Still, a child needs more than one household to truly flourish. You should bring her to town, let her socialize with other children. My sister's little ones ask for her often." "Perhaps when she's a bit older," Nathaniel demurred. "Nonsense. Children learn from each other from the earliest age." Rebecca fixed him with a determined look. "In fact, we're having a gathering this Sunday after church. Nothing formal, just a few families with young children. You should come, both of you," she added, including Adelaide in the invitation with a graciousness that seemed only slightly forced. Nathaniel looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Rebecca, you know I don't attend church regularly. Yes, I'm aware," she interrupted. "But this isn't about your spiritual obligations, Nathaniel. It's about Grace having a community. Sophia would want that." The invocation of his late wife's wishes was clearly a familiar and effective tactic. Nathaniel's resistance visibly crumbled. "Perhaps we could come for the gathering after the service," he conceded. Rebecca smiled triumphantly. "Excellent! Everyone will be so pleased to see Grace again. She turned to Adelaide. And to meet you, of course, Mrs. Sinclair. Sophia's cousin, what an extraordinary story. As Rebecca prepared to leave a short while later, she drew Adelaide aside, while Nathaniel retrieved a jar of honey from the pantry, a gift Calvin Porter had brought for Rebecca's mother, who apparently suffered from a persistent cough. "Mrs. Sinclair," Rebecca said quietly, her expression now serious, "I loved Sophia dearly, and I care deeply for Grace and Nathaniel's welfare." "As do I," Adelaide replied with equal seriousness. Rebecca studied her, searching for something in Adelaide's face. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, for she nodded slightly before continuing. "Nathaniel has been lost since Sophia's death. Grace has been his only anchor. It does my heart good to see him more present today." Adelaide wasn't sure how to respond to this observation. "Grief takes time to process." "Indeed, and sometimes it takes a new presence to help one move forward." Rebecca's gaze was penetrating. "You've brought something to this household that was missing, Mrs. Sinclair. Something beyond cooking and childcare." Before Adelaide could formulate a response to this startling assessment, Nathaniel returned with the honey jar, ending their private conversation. Rebecca accepted it with warm thanks, kissed Grace goodbye, and departed with a promise to expect them Sunday afternoon. As her buggy disappeared down the drive, Nathaniel sighed heavily. "I apologize if that was uncomfortable for you. Rebecca can be forceful." "She cares for you and Grace," Adelaide observed. "That's nothing to apologize for." "Yes, but her caring sometimes takes the form of organizing our lives according to her vision." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Adelaide had come to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "We don't have to attend this gathering if you'd prefer not to." Adelaide considered this. The prospect of facing the collective curiosity and judgment of the community was daunting. Yet she also recognized the wisdom in Rebecca's insistence that Grace needed wider social connections. "I think we should go," she decided. "Grace should know the community she'll grow up in. And—" she hesitated, then continued more softly, "and perhaps it's time I stopped hiding as well." Nathaniel looked at her with surprise. "Hiding from life, from people." Adelaide bounced Grace gently in her arms. "I've been a ghost since William died, Nathaniel, moving through the world without really being part of it. First in Victor's house, where I was barely tolerated, and now here where I've been safe but separate." "And you're ready to change that?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Adelaide looked down at Grace, drawing strength from the child's trusting gaze. "I think perhaps it's time to try." Nathaniel nodded slowly, a smile spreading across his face. Not the rare, fleeting expression she had glimpsed before, but something fuller reaching his eyes and softening the habitual sternness of his features. "Then we'll go to Rebecca's gathering," he declared. Together. The word hung between them, simple yet profound in its implications. Together, not as employer and employee, not as two broken people merely coexisting, but as a unit facing the world's judgment and curiosity as one. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long golden rectangles across the wooden floor, Adelaide felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Not quite hope, not quite contentment, but perhaps the seedling of both taking root in soil she had long believed barren of all but grief and duty. Outside, the prairie stretched vast and green beneath the endless blue bowl of the Nebraska sky. Somewhere in the barn, a newborn foal named Hope took another wobbly step toward strength. And in the quiet house that had known both joy and sorrow, two wounded healers and one small child began tentatively to imagine a future where past pain need not dictate all that was yet to come. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the kind of spring morning that seemed to promise only good things. Adelaide stood before the small mirror in her room, assessing her appearance with a critical eye. She had spent the previous evening washing and pressing her best dress, a modest navy blue garment with white piping that had once been considered fashionable, at least in Cold Creek's limited understanding of such matters. Her honey-colored hair was twisted into a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck, with a few strands left deliberately loose to soften her features. William had always liked her hair this way, though she rarely wore it so now. Too impractical for ranch work, too frivolous for a widow. You look beautiful. Adelaide startled, turning to find Nathaniel standing in her doorway, Grace perched on his hip. He wore his Sunday best, a clean white shirt, dark trousers, and a vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hair combed back from his forehead. He looked less like a rancher and more like the respected doctor he had once been. "Thank you," she replied, feeling a flush rise to her cheeks at the unexpected compliment. "And thank you for the ribbon." She touched the dark blue band woven through her hair, a gift Nathaniel had brought back from his solitary trip to town the day before. "It suits you." His gaze lingered a moment longer than strictly proper, then dropped away. "The wagon is ready whenever you are." Adelaide nodded, drawing a deep breath to steady herself. "I'm ready." The journey to town passed mostly in silence, each lost in private thoughts. Grace, dressed in a white pinafore that Adelaide had carefully embroidered with tiny forget-me-nots, babbled happily in her lap, oblivious to the tension emanating from the adults. As they approached Wildrose Creek, Adelaide found herself studying the small prairie town with new eyes. When she had last seen it, she had been standing on an auction block, her dignity in tatters. Now she returned as a respectable woman, a nurse, a housekeeper, a caretaker of Nathaniel Whitman's child. Not an equal to the townspeople, perhaps, but no longer property to be bought and sold. The church stood at the northern edge of town, a simple white clapboard building with a modest steeple. Its doors were open wide, and the sound of hymn singing drifted out across the quiet Sunday streets. The service had already begun. "We'll wait," Nathaniel decided, drawing the wagon to a halt beneath a cottonwood tree a respectful distance from the church. "Rebecca's gathering doesn't start until after the service anyway." Adelaide nodded, grateful for his consideration. She wasn't quite ready to face the collective curiosity of the entire congregation. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the distant singing. Grace dozed against Adelaide's shoulder, lulled by the journey and the gentle spring breeze. "Are you nervous?" Nathaniel asked quietly. Adelaide considered the question. "Yes," she admitted, "but not for the reasons I would have expected, not because of how they might see me." "Why, then?" She turned to look at him, finding his gaze already on her. "Because of how I see myself. I've been hiding for so long, Nathaniel. From life, from connection, from—" She trailed off, unable to fully articulate the strange mixture of anticipation and fear that had kept her awake much of the previous night. "From the possibility of happiness," he finished for her, his voice gentle. Adelaide nodded, surprised by his perception. "Yes, exactly that." "I understand," he said simply, and she knew he did, perhaps better than anyone else could. They had both retreated from life after profound losses, both built walls around their hearts, both convinced themselves that duty and work were adequate substitutes for joy. The church doors opened, releasing a stream of well-dressed townspeople into the spring sunshine. Nathaniel straightened his expression, shifting from the openness of their private conversation to a more guarded public face. "Shall we?" he asked, offering his hand to help her down from the wagon. Adelaide took it, noticing how his fingers closed firmly around hers, offering support beyond the physical. "Yes," she said, gathering her courage. "It's time." Rebecca's home was a modest but well-maintained house on the eastern edge of town, its yard bright with early spring flowers. Several wagons and buggies were already parked outside when Nathaniel, Adelaide, and Grace arrived. Rebecca greeted them at the door, resplendent in a rust-colored dress that complemented her auburn hair. Her smile of welcome seemed genuine, if somewhat reserved for Adelaide. "You came wonderful!" she exclaimed, immediately reaching for Grace, who went to her willingly. "Everyone is in the garden. Come, Mrs. Sinclair, let me introduce you." Adelaide exchanged a quick glance with Nathaniel, drawing strength from his reassuring nod, then followed Rebecca through the house to a sunny back garden where perhaps a dozen adults and several children were gathered. Conversation dimmed momentarily as they stepped outside, curious eyes turning to assess the newcomers. "Everyone," Rebecca announced. "You know Nathaniel and Grace, of course. But please welcome Mrs. Adelaide Sinclair, Grace's nurse, and—" she paused dramatically. "Sophia's cousin." A murmur of surprise rippled through the gathering. Adelaide felt the weight of their scrutiny, but kept her chin high, her posture straight. The same dignity she had maintained on the auction block now serving her in a different kind of public examination. A tall woman with silver-streaked dark hair was the first to approach her keen eyes, assessing Adelaide with undisguised curiosity. "Esther Holloway," she introduced herself. "I was Sophia's closest friend in town after Rebecca. She never mentioned having a cousin." "We lost touch during the war," Adelaide explained, offering the simplified version of their complicated history. "I believed she had perished when our family home in Virginia was destroyed. She believed the same of me." Esther's expression softened slightly. "The war separated many families. How extraordinary that you should find each other again, even if—" she trailed off delicately, "even if too late for a reunion in this life," Adelaide finished for her. "Yes, but I'm grateful to know her daughter, to see the woman Sarah, Sophia, became through the memories of those who loved her." This diplomatic response seemed to satisfy Esther, who nodded approvingly. "You must tell me more about your shared childhood later. Sophia spoke so little of her early years." Before Adelaide could respond, a small commotion near the gate drew everyone's attention. A man in a deputy's uniform had entered the garden, his manner apologetic but purposeful. Adelaide recognized him immediately. James Miller, the lieutenant whose arm she had saved at Antietam, now apparently serving as Wildrose Creek's law enforcement. Miller scanned the gathering, his gaze settling on Nathaniel. He approached with measured steps, tipping his hat respectfully. "Mr. Whitman, Mrs. Sinclair, I apologize for interrupting the festivities, but I need a word with you both." A hush fell over the garden. Adelaide felt Nathaniel move protectively closer to her side. "What about Deputy?" Nathaniel asked, his voice level, but with an undercurrent of tension. Miller's eyes flickered to the curious onlookers. "Perhaps somewhere more private." Rebecca immediately stepped forward. "You can use my parlor." She led them back into the house, closing the garden door firmly behind them to discourage eavesdroppers. Grace remained in Esther's care, oblivious to the sudden tension. In the parlor, Miller removed his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I'm afraid I have troubling news. Victor Caldwell arrived in town yesterday evening." Adelaide felt the blood drain from her face. Nathaniel's hand found the small of her back, steadying her. "What does he want?" Nathaniel demanded. Miller looked uncomfortable. "He claims Mrs. Sinclair is still legally his property, that the sale was invalid because she was already legally bound to his household through her marriage to his late brother." "That's absurd," Nathaniel said flatly. "She's a widow." Her husband's death ended any legal obligation to his family. Under normal circumstances, yes, Miller agreed. But Caldwell has documents, some kind of contract he says William Sinclair signed before his death, placing his wife under his brother's guardianship in the event of his passing. Adelaide's mind reeled. That's impossible. William would never have done such a thing. Nevertheless, Caldwell has papers with what appears to be Dr. Sinclair's signature, Miller said grimly. He's demanding your return, Mrs. Sinclair. And, he hesitated, glancing at Nathaniel. He's threatening to involve the territorial courts if you don't comply voluntarily. Nathaniel's expression hardened. Tell Caldwell that Mrs. Sinclair is under my protection now. If he wants to pursue this, he'll have to do it through proper legal channels. Miller nodded, clearly relieved by Nathaniel's calm response. I'll convey your message, but you should know. He's staying at the hotel. Says he won't leave until this matter is resolved. Thank you for the warning, Deputy, Nathaniel said, effectively dismissing him. Once Miller had departed, Adelaide sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. He forged William's signature, she said, her voice hollow with disbelief. He must have. William would never have given me into Victor's guardianship. Nathaniel knelt beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. Listen to me, Adelaide. Victor Caldwell will not take you from this home, from Grace, from... He faltered, then continued with quiet intensity. From me. I won't allow it. Adelaide looked into his eyes, finding strength in his certainty. We need to leave. Now, before he comes looking for me. Running would only make you appear guilty of something, came Rebecca's voice from the doorway. She had entered so quietly, neither had noticed her presence. You need to face this accusation directly. Adelaide turned to her in surprise. You were listening. Of course I was, Rebecca replied unapologetically. This concerns Grace's welfare, too. She moved into the room, her expression determined. Victor Caldwell's reputation precedes him. Cold Creek merchants speak of his dishonest business practices, and travelers tell worse stories. He's dangerous, Adelaide confirmed quietly. Not with his fists, but with his mind. He manipulates, twists the truth until you doubt your own memories. Then we must be smarter than he is, Rebecca declared, pacing the small parlor. These documents he claims to have, they must be forgeries. Is there anyone who would recognize your husband's true signature, someone beyond reproach? Adelaide thought for a moment. Calvin Porter, she said suddenly. William treated him during the war. They corresponded afterward. Calvin would know William's handwriting. Nathaniel nodded. Calvin would make a credible witness. But we need more than that to counter Victor's claims. What about your marriage certificate? Rebecca suggested. Or other legal documents with William's authentic signature. Adelaide's heart sank. Victor took everything after William's death. All our papers, William's medical journals, even our wedding photograph. A heavy silence fell as they all contemplated the difficult position. Then Nathaniel straightened a new resolve in his bearing. There is one thing Victor doesn't know, he said quietly. My true identity. As Dr. Nathan Gray, I worked alongside William Sinclair. I know his handwriting as well as my own, and more importantly, I have proof of it. Adelaide looked at him in surprise. You do? Nathaniel nodded. In my study. Letters William wrote to me after the war when I was establishing my new identity. Letters that discuss you, Adelaide, and his concerns for your future if anything should happen to him. Hope flickered to life in Adelaide's chest. Letters that would prove Victor's guardianship claim is false. Exactly. Nathaniel turned to Rebecca. We need to return to the ranch immediately to retrieve those letters. Can you make our excuses to your guests? Rebecca nodded, already moving toward the door. Of course, but be careful. Men like Caldwell don't give up easily when they believe something belongs to them. Her choice of words, something rather than someone, was not lost on Adelaide. That was how Victor saw her, as property, not a person. The thought strengthened her resolve. "We'll face him together," she said, rising to her feet with renewed determination. "I'm tired of running from the past, tired of allowing others to determine my worth." Nathaniel looked at her with undisguised admiration. "Then let's go home and prepare for battle." The journey back to the ranch was tense, each lost in private thoughts while maintaining a vigilant watch on the road behind them. Grace, sensing the adult's unease, remained unusually quiet in Adelaide's lap, her small fingers clutching Adelaide's dress as if afraid she might disappear. When they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Adelaide felt a surge of emotion that caught her by surprise. In the few short weeks she had been there, this place had become more of a home than anywhere she had lived since the war. The thought of being forced to leave it, to leave Grace and Nathaniel, was almost physically painful. As they approached the house, Adelaide noticed another wagon already parked in the yard. Calvin Porter sat on the porch, his expression grave as he watched their approach. "We have company," Nathaniel observed unnecessarily, his hands tightening on the reins. Calvin rose as they drew to a halt, his weathered face creasing in a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thought you folks would be in town all afternoon," he called, descending the porch steps with the careful movements of age. "Change of plans," Nathaniel replied, helping Adelaide down from the wagon, his hand lingering supportively at her elbow. "Is something wrong, Calvin?" The older man glanced at Adelaide, then back to Nathaniel. "Might be. Rode into town for supplies this morning and heard some disturbing news. Thought I should warn you." "Victor Caldwell," Adelaide said, clutching Grace closer. "We know. Deputy Miller found us at Rebecca's." Calvin nodded grimly. "Figured word would spread fast. That man's been asking questions all over town. About you, Nate. About the ranch. About Mrs. Sinclair here." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. What kind of questions? The kind meant to sow doubt, implying Mrs. Sinclair ran away from legal obligations, suggesting you might have improper motivations for bringing her here. Calvin's expression made it clear what kind of insinuations Victor had been making. Adelaide felt heat rise to her cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and anger. Victor has always excelled at poisoning minds against those who stand in his way. "Well, he's found fertile ground in some quarters," Calvin said bluntly, "but not all. Those who know you, Nate, they're standing firm." "We need to retrieve something from my study," Nathaniel said, already moving toward the house. "Letters from William Sinclair that should help disprove Victor's claims." Calvin followed them inside, bouncing Grace gently when she reached for his familiar face. "William Sinclair, the army surgeon." Adelaide paused in surprise. "You knew my husband. Treated my grandson after Gettysburg. Saved his leg." Calvin studied her with new interest. "You're that Sinclair doctor." "Sinclair's wife?" "Yes." Adelaide confirmed, a bittersweet pride warming her voice. "I assisted him during the war. We married in '64. Calvin shook his head in wonderment. "Well, I'll be. Small world indeed." His expression grew serious again. "All the more reason to stop this Caldwell fellow. William Sinclair saved a lot of good men. His widow deserves better than to be treated like property." Inside the study, Nathaniel went directly to a locked drawer in his desk. He extracted a small key from his vest pocket, opened the drawer, and removed a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. "These are all I have left of my former life," he explained, untying the ribbon with careful fingers. "Correspondence between colleagues mostly, but several are from William. He spread the letters on the desk, quickly scanning each, until he found what he was looking for. "Here," he said, holding up a letter dated January 1868. "This one mentions you specifically, Adelaide." She moved closer, Grace still in her arms, to read over his shoulder. William's familiar handwriting brought an unexpected lump to her throat. "My dear Gray, I hope this letter finds you well in your new life. Nebraska sounds like a fine place to begin again, though I confess I cannot imagine you as a cattle rancher rather than a surgeon. Still, we all find our paths to healing in different ways. Adelaide sends her warmest regards. She often speaks of your kindness to her during those dark days at Antietam. She has finally begun to recover her strength after the injury that took our hopes for children, though I fear the emotional wound may never fully heal. Should anything happen to me, I worry greatly for her future. My brother Victor, while financially secure, lacks understanding of Adelaide's true worth, beyond her ability to produce heirs. I have made provisions in my will to ensure she remains independent. But in these uncertain times, legal documents have a way of disappearing when convenient to others. I have taken the liberty of writing to Dr. Thomas at Massachusetts General about a potential position for you should ranching prove less fulfilling than anticipated. Your skills are too valuable to be lost to the medical profession permanently." Adelaide's vision blurred with tears as she read her husband's words. Even then, he had worried about Victor's intentions. Even then, he had sought to protect her. "This proves William never intended for Victor to be my guardian," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And it confirms you knew William, that you would recognize his signature." Nathaniel nodded, carefully refolding the letter. "There's more. In a later letter, William mentions specifically that he refused Victor's suggestion to grant him guardianship over you in his will. That should be enough to challenge whatever forged documents Victor has produced," Calvin said confidently, "especially with my testimony about knowing both William and his handwriting from our correspondence after the war." Adelaide felt hope rising, but it was tempered by cold reality. "Victor won't give up easily. He believes I belong to him, or rather, that what should have been William's estate belongs to him. He's never forgiven William for marrying beneath the Caldwell family standing. Then we must be prepared for whatever he might do next," Nathaniel said, grimly gathering the letters. "Calvin, would you be willing to accompany us back to town tomorrow? I'd like to settle this matter as quickly as possible." "Of course," the older man agreed readily. "Been looking for a chance to repay Dr. Sinclair's kindness for years now. This seems fitting." As Calvin departed, promising to return at first light, Adelaide found herself standing in the doorway of the study, watching Nathaniel carefully return the precious letters to their drawer. In the late afternoon light, his profile was sharp against the window behind him. A man of quiet strength, of hidden depths, of surprising tenderness, beneath a reserved exterior. "Thank you," she said softly, "for fighting for me." Nathaniel looked up, his expression softening as he met her gaze. "You're worth fighting for, Adelaide. I only wish you believed that as firmly as I do." The simple statement, delivered without artifice or expectation, pierced something long frozen within her. Before she could respond, Grace squirmed in her arms, demanding attention with increasingly insistent babbles. "Someone's hungry." Nathaniel observed the intimate moment, broken but not forgotten. "I'll see to dinner while you tend to her." Adelaide nodded, grateful for the momentary reprieve to collect her turbulent emotions. As she prepared Grace's evening bottle, her mind returned to William's letter and the confirmation of what she had always known in her heart, that her husband had loved her truly, had valued her beyond her ability to bear children, had tried to protect her, even from beyond the grave. The knowledge strengthened her. Whatever Victor might bring against her tomorrow, she would face it, not just as Adelaide Sinclair, barren widow and purchased housekeeper, but as a woman of worth, of value, of purpose, beyond what others had defined for her. Monday morning dawned clear and cool, with a brisk wind that bent the prairie grasses in undulating waves across the landscape. Adelaide, dressed with deliberate care in her navy blue dress, the same one she had worn to Rebecca's gathering. Her hair was arranged simply but neatly, her posture erect, her expression composed despite the anxiety churning beneath her calm exterior. Grace sensed the tension in the household and was fussy during her morning feeding, refusing her bottle until Adelaide sang softly to her the same lullaby she had used during the storm. The familiar melody soothed them both. Nathaniel entered the kitchen as Adelaide was burping Grace his own appearance as carefully tended as hers. He wore a black frock coat she had never seen before, more suited to a professional man than a rancher, and had trimmed his beard to a neat precision that emphasized the strong line of his jaw. "You look," Adelaide began, then faltered, uncertain how to express what she saw in him, the echo of Dr. Nathan Gray emerging from beneath Nathaniel Whitman's more rugged exterior. "Like my former self," he finished for her understanding in his eyes. It felt appropriate, given the circumstances. Calvin arrived as promised just after sunrise, similarly dressed in his Sunday best, a formal quality to his bearing that spoke of his military background. Together, the three adults and Grace set out for town, the atmosphere in the wagon heavy with anticipation. Wildrose Creek was already bustling with morning activity when they arrived. Shopkeepers opening their establishments, women gathering at the well in the town square, farm wagons delivering produce and milk to the general store. Conversation dimmed as Nathaniel guided the wagon down the main street, curious eyes following their progress. "The hotel first," Nathaniel decided, drawing the wagon to a halt before the two-story building that served as Wildrose Creek's only accommodation for travelers. "Better to confront Victor directly than wait for him to find us." Adelaide nodded, steeling herself for the confrontation to come. Calvin offered to remain with Grace in the wagon, a suggestion Adelaide gratefully accepted. The thought of Victor being anywhere near the child made her blood run cold. Inside the hotel's small lobby, the clerk recognized Nathaniel immediately, his eyes widening at the unusual sight of the normally reclusive rancher in town twice in 1 week. "Mr. Whitman," he greeted with nervous deference. "How may I help you today?" "We're here to see Victor Caldwell," Nathaniel replied, his tone leaving no room for evasion. The clerk glanced uncertainly between Nathaniel and Adelaide. "Mr. Caldwell checked out early this morning, sir. Said he had pressing business elsewhere." Adelaide felt a surge of relief quickly tempered by suspicion. Victor was not one to abandon a pursuit so easily. "Did he say where he was going?" she asked. "No, ma'am, but he did leave in quite a hurry after receiving a message." The clerk hesitated, then added, "He seemed agitated." Nathaniel and Adelaide exchanged concerned glances. "Thank you," Nathaniel said to the clerk, already turning to leave. "If he returns, please send word to the ranch immediately." Outside, they relayed the unexpected news to Calvin, whose weathered face creased in a frown. "Doesn't feel right," the old soldier muttered. "Men like that don't just give up and disappear." "No," Adelaide agreed, a cold dread settling in her stomach. "They don't." Nathaniel's expression had darkened to match her own concern. "We should speak with Deputy Miller, see if he knows anything about this message that sent Victor running." They found Miller at his small office adjacent to the town jail, poring over wanted posters with a cup of coffee at his elbow. He looked up in surprise as they entered. "Mr. Whitman, Mrs. Sinclair." His gaze moved to Calvin. "Mr. Porter, what brings you all to town so early?" "Victor Caldwell," Nathaniel replied without preamble. He's checked out of the hotel. Do you know why me? Miller set down his coffee cup, his expression careful. Can't say I do. Last I spoke with him, he was determined to pursue his claim against Mrs. Sinclair. He received a message this morning, Adelaide pressed. Something that sent him leaving in a hurry. Miller shook his head. I don't know anything about a message. Nothing came through the telegraph office. I would have been notified of anything official. Then it must have been delivered in person, Calvin reasoned. Someone from Cold Creek, perhaps. Miller considered this. There was a rider came through before dawn. Didn't stop long. Just long enough to water his horse at the trough outside the saloon. Could have delivered something to Caldwell, I suppose. Can you describe this rider? Nathaniel asked. Miller shrugged. Average height, dark coat, kept his hat pulled low, nothing distinctive. He studied their concerned faces. Is there something specific you're worried about? Adelaide hesitated, then decided honesty might serve them best. Victor isn't one to abandon a goal once he's set his mind to it. If he's left town, it's because he's pursuing a different angle of attack. Miller's expression grew more serious. You think he might be planning something against you? Or the ranch? It's possible, Nathaniel confirmed grimly. He's made it clear he believes Adelaide belongs under his control. Miller rose from his desk, reaching for his hat. Then perhaps I should ride out to your place with you, just to be safe. Calvin nodded in approval. 4 sets of eyes are better than 3, and a badge carries weight even with men like Caldwell. As they exited the deputy's office, Rebecca Martinez's buggy came clattering down the street at an uncharacteristic speed. She pulled up sharply beside them, her face flushed with exertion or emotion, perhaps both. "Thank God I found you," she exclaimed, jumping down without waiting for assistance. "I was just on my way to the ranch. There's trouble." Adelaide felt her heart constrict. What kind of trouble? That man, Caldwell. He came to my house at dawn. Rebecca explained, her words tumbling out in uncharacteristic disarray. He had questions about Sophia, about you, Nathaniel, about Grace. Nathaniel's expression hardened. What did he want to know? Rebecca twisted her hands in her skirt, visibly distressed. He asked if Sophia had family besides Mrs. Sinclair, if there was anyone who might have a claim to Grace, if something happened to you. Adelaide felt the blood drain from her face. "He's after Grace," she whispered, turning instinctively to look at the child still sitting in the wagon with Calvin. "This was never just about me. He wants Grace, or rather any inheritance that might come to her." Nathaniel's face had gone deathly pale beneath his tan. "We need to get back to the ranch. Now." Miller was already striding toward his horse. "I'll ride ahead. Make sure everything's secure." "I'm coming too," Rebecca declared, climbing back into her buggy without waiting for agreement. The journey back to the ranch seemed interminable, though they pushed the horses harder than was strictly wise. Adelaide held Grace tightly against her chest, whispering reassurances that were as much for herself as for the child. When they finally crested the hill overlooking the ranch, Adelaide's worst fears were confirmed. A thin column of smoke rose from the direction of the barn, and 2 unfamiliar horses were tethered outside the house. "Victor!" She breathed, terror and rage warring in her chest. Nathaniel pulled the wagon to a halt at a safe distance. "Stay here with Grace," he instructed Adelaide, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Calvin, keep them safe." "Nathaniel, no!" Adelaide protested, reaching for his arm. "It's too dangerous. Wait for Deputy Miller." But Nathaniel was already climbing down from the wagon, his expression set in grim determination. "I won't hide while someone threatens my home, my family." The word hung in the air between them. Family, simple yet profound in its implications. Adelaide saw in his eyes what she had glimpsed only in unguarded moments before, that she and Grace had become more than employee and charge to him. They had become essential, precious, worth any risk. "Then I'm coming with you," she decided, passing Grace to Calvin's capable hands. "This is my fight, too." Nathaniel looked as if he might argue, then simply nodded, helping her down from the wagon. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "And if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments." Together they approached the house, moving cautiously across the open yard. The barn door stood ajar, wisps of smoke curling from within, but no visible flames. A diversion, Adelaide realized, meant to draw attention, while the real threat waited inside the house. They had nearly reached the porch when the front door opened. Victor Caldwell stepped out, immaculate, as always, in a tailored suit that seemed absurdly formal against the backdrop of the prairie ranch. Behind him loomed a man Adelaide didn't recognize, tall, broad-shouldered, with the hard eyes of someone who solved problems with his fists. "Ah, the happy family returns," Victor called, his cultured voice dripping with sarcasm. "How convenient! I was just making myself at home while awaiting your arrival." Nathaniel moved slightly, positioning himself more firmly between Adelaide and Victor. "You're trespassing on private property, Caldwell." Victor smiled, the expression never reaching his cold eyes. "Am I? I would argue that I'm simply retrieving what legally belongs to me." His gaze shifted to Adelaide, assessing her with the detached interest one might give livestock at auction. "My dear sister-in-law appears to be thriving under your care, Whitman. How touching. Whatever documents you've forged, they won't stand up to scrutiny," Adelaide said, finding her voice despite the fear clawing at her throat. "William never made you my guardian, never gave you any legal claim over me." Victor's smile tightened. "Perhaps not. But then, this was never really about you, Adelaide. Useful as you might be in my household, you were merely the means to a greater end." "Grace," Nathaniel said flatly, the single word laden with understanding and fury. "The child does complicate matters," Victor agreed smoothly. "As the only blood relative of William Sinclair's widow, she stands to inherit quite a substantial estate, once certain legal technicalities are resolved." Adelaide felt sick with the realization of Victor's true scheme. "There is no estate. William left nothing but debts." Victor's laugh was cold. "My dear Adelaide, your naivety would be charming if it weren't so tiresome. Your husband was many things, but financially irresponsible was not among them. The debts I spoke of after his death were largely fabricated, a convenient fiction to justify liquidating his assets into more portable forms." The casual admission of his fraud stunned Adelaide into momentary silence. "And now you believe Grace has some claim to this hidden fortune?" Nathaniel asked, his voice dangerously calm. "With Adelaide as her guardian, and myself as Adelaide's legal guardian, the child's inheritance would naturally fall under my stewardship," Victor explained, as if discussing a perfectly reasonable business arrangement. "A tidy solution to several problems at once." "Except Adelaide is not Grace's guardian," Nathaniel pointed out. "I am her father." Victor's smile widened. "Are you? That's not what my sources suggest." Adelaide felt Nathaniel tense beside her. "What are you talking about? It seems Dr. Nathan Gray was not as thorough in crafting his new identity as he might have hoped," Victor said, watching with evident satisfaction as shock registered on both their faces. "Yes, I know who you really are, Mr. Whitman, the disgraced Army surgeon who abandoned his post after Gettysburg, the man who left 23 men to die through his incompetence." Nathaniel flinched as if struck, the carefully constructed walls of his new identity crumbling under this direct assault. "That's not what happened," Adelaide said fiercely, stepping forward despite Nathaniel's protective stance. "You've twisted the truth as you always do." "Perhaps," Victor conceded with a careless shrug. "But the territorial courts won't care about nuance when they learn that Grace Whitman's father is living under a false identity, that her birth certificate lists a man who doesn't legally exist." He gestured expansively. "In such circumstances, the courts typically look for the closest blood relative to assume guardianship. And with you as my ward, Adelaide, that would be me." The breathtaking audacity of his scheme left Adelaide momentarily speechless. It was Victor at his most calculating, manipulating legal technicalities, exploiting vulnerabilities, all while maintaining a veneer of respectability. "It won't work," Nathaniel said, his voice steadier now. "Even if you expose my past, even if you challenge my legal right to Grace, you have no blood connection to her. Adelaide is Sophia's cousin, a much closer relation than you could ever claim." For the first time, Victor's confident facade showed a crack. "What did you say? Adelaide is Sophia's cousin," Nathaniel repeated. "They were separated during the war, each believing the other dead. Sophia's dying wish was for Adelaide to care for Grace, a wish I've honored by bringing her here." Victor's eyes narrowed as he reassessed the situation. "A convenient story, but without proof." "We have proof," Adelaide interrupted. "Letters from Sophia confirming our relationship. Witnesses who knew us both as children." She took a step forward, drawing strength from the truth. "You've built your scheme on sand, Victor, as you always do." The sound of approaching horses interrupted whatever response Victor might have made. Deputy Miller appeared at the edge of the property, Rebecca's buggy close behind. Calvin, still holding Grace, had moved the wagon closer as well, positioning himself where he could observe the confrontation while keeping the child safe. Victor assessed the changing dynamics with the cold calculation of a chess player seeing his position deteriorate. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice pitched for Nathaniel and Adelaide alone. "I've invested too much to walk away now." "It is over," came a new voice from behind them. Adelaide turned to see a man dismounting from a horse at the edge of the yard, a stranger in a dusty black coat with a weathered face and the unmistakable bearing of a lawman. "Marshal Edwards' Territorial Court," the newcomer introduced himself, approaching with purposeful strides. "I've been tracking Victor Caldwell across 3 territories on charges of fraud, forgery, and theft of estate." Victor's confident expression crumbled into something approaching fear. "This is absurd. I've committed no crime." Marshal Edwards smiled thinly. "The widow of Judge Carlton in Missouri disagrees, as do the children of Dr. Wilson in Kansas. And I suspect Ms. Sinclair here might have similar testimony to offer." He turned to Adelaide. "Ma'am, I apologize for the delay in reaching you. We've been building a case against Caldwell for nearly a year." Adelaide stared at the marshal in disbelief, hope and vindication washing through her in equal measure. "How did you find me?" "A letter from Calvin Porter reached my office last month," Edwards explained, nodding respectfully toward the elderly man still holding Grace protectively. "Said he had reason to believe Victor Caldwell was pursuing a scheme similar to ones he'd executed elsewhere. Mentioned a Dr. Sinclair's widow being sold at auction." His expression darkened. "That got my attention right quick." Calvin approached, still cradling Grace. "Told you I'd been watching Caldwell for a while," he said to Adelaide's astonished face. "William Sinclair saved my grandson's leg. Least I could do was look out for his widow." Victor was backing toward the porch steps, his hired man already edging toward the tethered horses. "This is a misunderstanding. I have documentation, Forged like all your other documentation, Marshal Edwards interrupted, producing a pair of handcuffs from his coat pocket. Victor Caldwell, you're under arrest for multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and theft. You have the right to remain silent. What followed was a blur of activity. Victor protesting as the marshal restrained him, the hired man attempting to flee, only to be intercepted by Deputy Miller. Rebecca rushing forward to check on Grace and Calvin, explaining in greater detail how he had suspected Victor's schemes from the beginning. Through it all, Adelaide stood rooted to the spot, unable to fully comprehend the sudden resolution of the threat that had hung over her for so long. It was only when Nathaniel's hand found hers, warm and solid and real, that she began to believe it was truly over. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, his eyes searching her face with concern. Adelaide nodded, words momentarily beyond her. After so many months of fear of powerlessness, of being treated as property rather than person, the simple fact of her newfound freedom was almost too enormous to grasp. Marshal Edwards approached them after securing Victor in his custody. "Mrs. Sinclair, I'll need a formal statement from you about Caldwell's actions following your husband's death. Can you come to town tomorrow?" "Of course," Adelaide agreed, finding her voice at last. "I'll tell you everything." "Good." The marshal's stern expression softened slightly. "For what it's worth, ma'am, I'm sorry for what you've endured. No one should be treated as property in this day and age." As the marshal and Deputy Miller departed with their prisoners, Rebecca stepped forward to return Grace to Adelaide's arms. The child came willingly, her small hands patting Adelaide's cheeks, as if sensing her turbulent emotions. "I should return to town," Rebecca said, her usual composure somewhat restored. "My mother will be wondering what's become of me." She hesitated, then added with uncharacteristic warmth, "I'm glad you're safe, Adelaide. Both of you." Her gaze included Nathaniel in this sentiment. Calvin was the last to depart, pausing beside Nathaniel with a significant look. "Reckon you two have some things to discuss," he observed with the wisdom of age. "But if you're interested in an old soldier's opinion, life's too short to waste on fear of what might have been or what might yet be." With that cryptic advice, he climbed onto his wagon and set off down the drive, leaving Nathaniel and Adelaide standing alone in the yard. Grace content in Adelaide's arms, the threat that had brought them together now removed, but the connection forged through shared adversity still very much present. "We should check the barn," Nathaniel said after a moment. "Make sure the fire is completely out." Adelaide nodded, grateful for the practical suggestion that gave them both time to process the morning's dramatic events. The fire in the barn proved to be minor, a smoldering hay bale that had produced more smoke than actual damage. Together, they doused it thoroughly, working in the companionable silence that had become their habit. It was only when they returned to the house, Grace settled for her afternoon nap, that the full impact of what had occurred and what had been revealed could no longer be deferred. "Victor knew about my past," Nathaniel said quietly, standing by the window in the sitting room, his back to Adelaide. "About Nathan Gray?" "Yes," she acknowledged, watching him carefully. "Does that concern you?" He turned to face her, his expression troubled. "It should. For years I've lived in fear of my former identity being discovered, of being judged for my failures at Gettysburg." "And now?" Adelaide prompted gently. Nathaniel considered the question, something shifting in his face as he did so. "Now I find I'm more concerned with what you think of me than what the world might say." The simple honesty of this statement touched Adelaide deeply. "I think you're a good man who made an impossible choice in impossible circumstances," she said softly. "I think you've punished yourself far more harshly than any court or medical board ever would." He moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. And what about Grace Victor was right about one thing? Legally, I may have no claim to her. If my identity as Nathan Gray were to become known, Grace is your daughter in every way that matters, Adelaide said firmly. No court would separate a child from the only father she's ever known, especially not when that father has provided so well for her. Nathaniel's expression softened with gratitude. Thank you for that. He hesitated, then continued with careful deliberation. There's something else we should discuss. Now that Victor is no longer a threat, you're free to go wherever you wish, to build a new life of your own choosing. Adelaide felt her heart constrict at the thought. Are you asking me to leave? No, he said quickly, taking another step toward her. God, no. I'm trying rather poorly to say that you no longer need to stay here out of necessity or obligation. If you choose to remain, it would be just that, a choice, your choice. The significance of what he was offering washed over Adelaide like a warm tide. Not employment, not charity, not duty, but agency. The freedom to determine her own path. And if I choose to stay, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What would that mean, Nathaniel? He drew a deep breath, as if gathering courage for a surgical procedure more daunting than any he had faced in the field hospitals of Virginia. It would mean whatever you wish it to mean. You could continue as Grace's nurse as my housekeeper, or— He trailed off, uncertainty clouding his features for the first time since she had known him. Or, Adelaide prompted, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. Or you could consider a more permanent arrangement, he said finally. One that would make us a true family in name, as well as in fact. Adelaide studied his face, reading there all that he could not bring himself to say directly, the longing, the hope, the fear of rejection that mirrored her own. Are you proposing marriage, Dr. Gray? She asked softly, deliberately, using his original name, acknowledging all of who he was, past and present combined. I suppose I am, Mrs. Sinclair, he replied, a smile beginning to warm his eyes. Though I'm making a terrible job of it. Adelaide felt an answering smile curve her own lips. On the contrary, I think you're doing just fine. Nathaniel moved closer, still close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from him. I can't offer you the life you had with William. I'm not the man I was before the war, before Gettysburg. I'm not even sure who I am sometimes, Nathan Gray or Nathaniel Whitman. Perhaps you're both, Adelaide suggested. Just as I am still the battlefield nurse and the woman who rocks Grace to sleep. We are all made of many parts, Nathaniel. The sum of our experiences, our choices, our loves and losses. He reached for her, then his hand gentle as it cupped her cheek. You make me believe that broken things can be mended, that what's damaged isn't necessarily destroyed. They can be. We aren't. Adelaide leaned into his touch, allowing herself to accept the comfort, the connection she had denied herself for so long. But I can't give you children of your own, Nathaniel. That hasn't changed. I have a child, he said simply, a daughter who adores you, who is becoming more like you every day in ways that have nothing to do with blood and everything to do with love. His thumb brushed her cheekbone with exquisite tenderness. I don't need more children, Adelaide. I just need you. The words unlocked something final within her. The last barrier she had maintained against the possibility of happiness, of a future beyond mere survival. With a soft sound that was half laugh, half sob, Adelaide closed the remaining distance between them, resting her forehead against his chest. Nathaniel's arms came around her, strong and sure, enfolding her in an embrace that felt at once new and familiar, as if some part of her had always known this particular sanctuary had been seeking it all along. "Is that a yes?" he murmured against her hair. Adelaide lifted her face to his, allowing him to see everything she felt. The joy, the hope, the lingering traces of fear, but above all the certainty. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, it is." His kiss was gentle at first, tentative, the kiss of a man who had forgotten the language of intimacy and was learning it anew. Adelaide responded in kind, her own heart remembering what it was to want to welcome to trust in tomorrow. When they parted, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "I never thought I would find this again," he admitted. "After Sophia, after everything, I believed that part of my life was over." "As did I," Adelaide confessed. "I had resigned myself to a life of service without connection, of duty without joy." From upstairs came the sound of Grace awakening from her nap, her babbling carrying clearly through the quiet house. They both smiled at the interruption, at the reminder of the small life that had brought them together. "I should get her," Adelaide said reluctantly, stepping back from Nathaniel's embrace. He caught her hand before she could move away. "We'll get her together," he suggested. "All three of us have a new beginning to celebrate." As they climbed the stairs side by side, Adelaide felt the weight of the past beginning to lift from her shoulders. Not forgotten, never that, but finally taking its proper place as prologue rather than defining chapter. Ahead lay an unwritten future, one she would craft with her own hands alongside the man who had seen her value when she had forgotten it herself. Outside, the Nebraska sky stretched endless and blue above the prairie, the land that had once seemed so alien to her now feeling inexplicably like home. From the barn came the soft nickering of Hope, the foal they had delivered together in the storm, a living symbol of what could be born from darkness and struggle. Grace's face lit up with delight when they entered the nursery together, her arms reaching out in unabashed welcome. As Adelaide lifted her from the crib, Nathaniel's arms settling naturally around them both, she understood at last what Calvin Porter had meant about promised lands. Sometimes they weren't places at all, but people. Sometimes the journey home was not to a destination you could find on any map, but to the hearts that recognized yours, that called you by your true name, that offered not just shelter, but belonging. Adelaide had found hers at last here on the Nebraska frontier, with a man who had also been lost, and a child who needed them both. Not the life she had once envisioned, but perhaps the one she had always been meant to find. Her own personal promised land, reached not through perfect navigation, but through the beautiful, painful, necessary detours of the heart.